Hello and welcome to the Ask Assaad show. I'm Michael Gaines and glad you are joining us on this 31st episode of the Ask Assaad show, where we aim to bring insight out by bringing experts and perspectives from around the world to give you insight into the world of energy and not only the people, but places and ideas helping shape what allows the world to continue to go around. So we're glad that you are joining us today, and we have a very special guest with us today that we're honored to have and look forward to having a great conversation. Before we dive in and get everyone else in, we want to have Shelby Dumaine to join us and talk about how you can be a part of today's conversation as well. Hey, Shelby.
Hey, Michael. Absolutely. So for everybody watching at home, if you would like to get involved in the show and ask, like Michael said, we have a really great guest today. So if you'd like to ask them a question, or even if you would like to ask Assaad, I got to plug the show name there. If you'd like to ask Assaad any questions, you can do so by commenting below, whether you're on Facebook, LinkedIn, or YouTube. I'm in the comment section of all three platforms throughout the entire show. So I like to see everyone's questions there. I start gathering them together. And then at the end of the episode, we will do a live Q&A with Assaad and our special guest here coming up. And speaking of the comments, if we want to do a little practice now for commenting below, I love seeing where everyone's from. So just glancing at the comments, I see Peru, I see Algeria, Houston, Pakistan, a lot of really great places. And I really love seeing where our audience is tuning in from. So definitely let us know where you're watching. And then after the show, say if you have more questions for us, maybe even if you want to give us an idea for a future episode that you would like to see, you can do so a couple ways. You can email us. So the email for the show is askassaad@nov.com. It's on the screen now. And then the second way is you can give us a call. I love this. You can leave us a voicemail. And by doing so, you can stay anonymous if you feel more comfortable, or you can let us know your name and maybe even where you work and what you do, and we can shout you out in a future episode. And that number is, we'll put it on the screen as well. It's country code +1 346 223 4799. So like I said, we would love to hear from you. I think the audience, I know I feel like every time I have a new favorite part of the show, but truly throughout everything, my favorite part is the audience and seeing your questions and how much you get involved in the show. I really appreciate it.
Well, I'll second that. That's a very worthy observation, because that's what really makes the show happen. So certainly appreciative of our viewers. Well, thanks Shelby for that. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and bring in the show's namesake. So Assaad Mahana, the Director of Business Strategy for NOV. Assaad, I put on a sweater vest today because I can't say it's cold, because if I say cold, I'm going to get a lot of emails saying you don't know cold. But it's
Europe will laugh at you.
It's cool.
It is cool. I missed my vest.
Yeah.
I did have my Rice University jacket today, though.
Oh man, I know. I did see your jacket. It's nice. I'm not worthy enough to wear a Rice University jacket, but you wore it well. So
yeah.
Well, good. Well, hey man, good to see you. As always, it's like I'm a broken record, but
and count me in with Shelby and you with regards to the audience. I mean, without our audience coming back every single show, I think this show would not exist. So thank you.
That 31. So we're certainly appreciative that that they've given us the momentum and confidence to continue to make it, and looking for 31 plus more as we go along.
Yeah.
So good. Well, Assaad, I know as always you have your nose to the grindstone when it comes to things happening in the world of energy, and I know today's going to be a little abbreviated, only because we want to really make sure we have time for our guests, but to kind of fill us in on things that are top of mind for you, and certainly top of mind in the overall energy space. What's been on your eye this week?
You're right. I want to make this brief because of our guest, given ample time to have our good discussion today. But I want to mention that it is earnings season, and we've seen earnings reports starting to trickle in over the last few weeks for the third quarter of 2020. And as you'd expect, Michael, like Q2 was a painful quarter. We're still seeing activity decline internationally still in some places. Towards the end of the quarter, we've seen some relief, some rig count increase in some places, but not quite there yet. So overall, you could guess what the environment's been in the earnings that we've heard so far. Still a environment of restructuring, reinvention in some cases. Companies are taking this opportunity to really reevaluate their business models, how they manage their businesses, which in the grand scheme of things, I know it's painful for some companies are struggling. We have talked about the increase in M&A activity, but in the grand scheme of things, in the relevance to recovery, I think all of that is in favor of in that direction. So good to see some of these actions being taken. Good to see some of that capital intensive businesses looking again and how they could manage it, and really getting back to a healthier way of running the oil and gas industry as a whole.
Right. So I know that we'll certainly need to. We'll be keeping our eyes on it. I know that you will be as we round out the rest of this year and look towards getting into seeing how Q4 and really the kind of the overall year went early next year. But appreciate your perspective on that, Assaad. I really appreciate it. So if you're good with it, Assaad, I think I want to go ahead and introduce our guest. Like we said, it's a really fortunate. We have Dr. Kenneth B. Medlock. He is going to be joining us. He is the James A. Baker III and Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics and Senior Director of the Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies. He's also the Director of the Master of Energy Economics program and supervises PhD students. He holds an adjunct appointments in the departments of economics and civil and environmental engineering at Rice University and is the chair of the Energy and Environment Initiatives Faculty Advisory Board. With an introduction like that, I am really appreciative for you taking the time to be with us, Dr. Medlock. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I know that to Assaad's point, he's a current student at Rice, but also a fan and certainly appreciative of that you've done, Dr. Medlock. So Assaad, I'm going to let you lead us off here today.
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and great to have you on the show, Ken. Thank you for joining us. Our topic for the day, we said in the forward promo, is going to be energy transition, and it's also going to be comparative advantage. I'm going to give you the chance to explain what that is because it's still not very clear to me what it is. But I want to start with a question first, maybe tee that off. When we talk about the energy transition today, it seems like this equation that works everywhere you go. But we know for a fact that that's not true. There's a push for a cleaner generation and use of energy. It'll probably be a little more complicated than what we see in the news on a day-to-day basis. Is energy transition as simple as it's portrayed, or is it a one-size-fit-all, do you think?
Well, certainly it's not. And we can go through a few examples, which I'm happy to do to sort of highlight that point. You're absolutely correct. When people talk about the energy transition, they do it sort of in a singular sense, and in many respects, that sort of is not entirely honest to what's happening around the world. When you look around the world of energy, you quickly see that it's a world of haves and have-nots. The reason for this is really quite simple. access to energy is very much determined by overall wealth. So economic prowess, you think about the world, the developed world in particular, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. There's 1.3 billion people in the OECD. They largely are pretty well off. Yes, there are pockets of poverty that's persistent no matter how wealthy societies get. But in general, access to energy is more or less a foregone conclusion. When you step outside the OECD to the other 6.7 billion people, or 6.4 billion people on the planet, I'm sorry, you see a very different, much more heterogeneous picture. Over the last 30 or so years now, you've started to see the emergence of some large developing Asian economies, China in particular, more recently India, through the 90s up until the Asian financial crisis. The ASEAN region was growing tremendously. For those of you who are old enough to remember, you can think back. People were talking about the Asian tigers and growth of textile manufacturing and stuff like that. So that part of the world collectively, just China into the ASEAN, is on the order of 3.4 billion people. And their per capita incomes on average are much lower than they are in the OECD. So there's a lot of room to run in terms of economic growth and improvements of living standards. And typically what comes with that is growth in energy demand. And I haven't even gotten to the other 3 billion people on the planet, but we'll get there eventually. But when we look at what's happening in different places around the world with regard to the energy transition, as it's often referred to, it's important to recognize that it's probably better to characterize it as energy transitions. And our own research has been sort of pushing us in that direction for quite some time. It was actually interesting during our annual energy summit just a few weeks ago. We had Dave Turk from the IEA presenting their view of global energy markets, and he emphasized that point. You really have to characterize these things in the plural sense, because it looks different everywhere. Mm-hmm. And to just highlight a point, if you are in Northwest Europe, and you can see these from the air, right? The prevalence of wind generation off the coast of the Netherlands and Denmark, it's remarkable. Flying over from Norway, for example, it's undeniable how rapidly wind power in the offshore in that region has grown. There's barely an acre without a wind turbine on it. But it's still intermittent power. And so one of the challenges is figuring out how to develop not only storage, which tends to be the frame of mind right now when people talk about intermittency and electrification, et cetera, but it's also about other forms of generation, increasing connectivity. So the ability to spatially arbitrage power requirements, and you need transmission to do that. And so one of the things that's being discussed in earnest in Northwest Europe is connecting all of those intermittent resources up more deeply with other forms of generation in neighboring countries, namely hydropower in the Scandinavian region, which is also prevalent. And hydro is a wonderful battery, natural battery, because you can load follow with water almost instantaneously. And so it allows an element of stability to be provided in a market where there's increasing penetration of intermittent resources. Right. So that's great, right? You're talking about potentially a near zero carbon electricity generation mix. Mm-hmm. The problem is you can't superimpose that topographic and geographic reality anywhere else in the world.
That's right.
And so you end up in a situation where if you want to integrate, renewables more intensively, you've got to think about other ways to balance that. In the state of Texas, the balancing item has been natural gas. And it's done tremendously well. In fact, the state of Texas is the wind capital of the United States. I think some people don't realize that, right? But 26% of the nation's capacity is in the state of Texas. So it's pretty remarkable. But again, it's that balancing factor that is important. In other places around the world, natural gas maybe isn't so prevalent, so you've got to think about other technologies. But at the end of the day, you have to quickly realize that there's a host of factors that drive what can be done. certain places where solar power is being solar panels are being installed and solar power is being harvested. In reality, when you look at solar irradiance maps, they're not the best places to go do that, right? But there's significant public support for it, and consumers are willing to do so. But long term, if you're thinking about the energy transitions in various regions, you've got to recognize that native resources matter. It really is important to understand what you have a lot of and how you can harvest it and do it in a more sustainable way.
And you have limitations when it comes to dust, for instance, in deserted areas like we discussed. And
so when you go to the
limitation.
Absolutely, when you go to the Middle East, for example, I mean in North Africa, there's the solar irradiance is just tremendous, and so it seems like a natural place to install lots and lots of solar panels. But you do have issues with dust and etching and things like that that occurs with dust storms. So you've got to be able to manage that if you're going to actually push in that direction. So
I have a question for you, Dr. Medlock. Maybe, and this is I'm drawing on an item that you wrote about recently in the July 2020 issue of the Oxford Energy Forum. You mentioned the three specific elements that you said in essence need to be considered in the context of energy transition. So you talked about the idea of legacy. You talked about the idea of scale and technology. Can you expound like why those three, but more specifically, what do those entail?
Yeah. So typically when we hear discussions, energy transitions discussions, not all those elements are entertained. And that's actually a problem with the discussion itself. Legacy matters because legacy, particularly when you get into very capital intensive industries, defines the state of the world that you exist in today. So if we think about the United States, for example, and why legacy would matter in the United States, and we can talk about other countries as well, but in the United States, we've seen over the last decade a pretty steady decline in the use of coal in power generation. That is largely the result of economic drivers, also some uncertainty about the future of coal, which has a negative impact on investment in that space. But the retirements themselves are largely based on economics. And you then have to ask the question, well, what is that doing to stranded costs of capital, things that we have to worry about when we have assets that have not outlived their useful life. And when you think about coal, what you have to recognize is that the last major build out of coal-fired generation capacity in the United States was between 1978 and 1982. Mm-hmm. And what drove a lot of that, quite frankly, was policy directive. The U.S. has a ton of coal, more than any other country in the world. Something like a quarter of the world's recoverable coal is in the United States. So you kind of hit rewind all the way back to the 70s, and we're on the heels of the Arab oil embargo, the Iran-Iraq war, the Iranian Revolution. Lots of concerns about dependence on oil. Triggered a lot of interest in doing other things. We were also in a period of time then where it was largely believed that we were going to be we weren't going to have enough natural gas to do anything with anymore. And so that sort of pointed to coal and other resources. And so coal took off. But when you built those facilities back then, a lot of them were designed with a roughly 40-year life in mind. And you got to sort of ask the question, where are we right now? Yep. We're sort of 40 years later, right? And that basically tells you that developers have a choice, right, with these aging assets. They can upgrade and retrofit to come into compliance with new air standards and water standards and other things, depending on where they are, or they can retire and replace. And it just so happens that the massive build out of gas combined cycle capacity in the United States between 03 and 05, so much more recently, left a massive underutilized gas-fired genset that could easily begin to be dispatched as soon as gas prices dropped. And nobody foresaw, what happened post 2009, right, when gas prices dropped and stayed low. Mm-hmm. But certainly what it did, given all the fixed costs of new capacity were sunk, is it provided a golden opportunity for system operators and generators to retire and replace old coal. And so that's exactly what you've seen going on. But all of that is intimately linked to legacy. So the legacy of the asset bases that were in place and how they competed. When you start talking about introducing new generation sources, you have to realize that the fixed costs of existing legacies are sunk. And so they don't really factor into whether or not those assets operate. And so when you're thinking about the economics of power generation dispatch, things that are already on the grid have a distinct advantage versus things that need to be built. And so that tends to slow the pace of adjustment. If we go to places like China, the coal-fired generation legacy is much younger there. In fact, on the order of just over half of their legacy coal asset base has been built in the last decade. So, it's a young fleet, which means it's going to be around for a while and it's going to be generating power for a while. An important point about all of this is demand is also growing in certain places much faster than it is in others. So in places like the US and Europe, demand really isn't growing that much. As a matter of fact, for the last 15 or so years, demand for overall energy use has been relatively flat. When you go outside the US and Europe and you look at places like China, India, ASEAN, other places, demand's been growing quite robustly. So it's not going to be that surprising to see coal lose market share in a place like China, even though its legacy asset base is younger. But it's important to understand that share doesn't tell you the whole story, because a simple example I use with my students is, imagine you have a pie and you own half the pie. You're going to be pretty happy if you like pie, right? But you own half of it. Now imagine the size of the pie doubles. How much of the pie now do I need to have the exact same amount of pie? It's 25%. So my ownership share actually fell pretty dramatically, but I have the exact same footprint. And that's actually an important point when we start getting into discussions about energy transitions that is sometimes lost. It's yes, market shares are shifting. We're seeing growth in renewables and other types of generation assets, but it doesn't mean that the market for other fuels is deteriorating. You really have to look at the picture for what it is. That's actually where scale comes in. So touched on legacy. Scale is about the size of the energy system. It's massive. Turning it over is not going to happen on a dime. Yes, pressures are mounting, and yes, you will continue to see new energy technologies integrate into the energy system globally. And in places where there are no real massive legacy bases, to the extent those new energy technologies are cheaper, they'll get adopted faster. That is definitely the truth. But again, you have to reconcile, if you're talking about, let's say, a sub-Saharan African country that has a massive natural gas resource base. Typically, and this is true historically for all energy, for all companies or countries as they begin to grow their energy footprints, you use what you have first. And so your legacies and sort of building into scale are not just defined by what's on the ground in terms of capital assets. It's also defined by your resource base. Yep. So all of that factors in. And technology is the thing at the margin that moves the needle. But the one thing that we always have to remember is, when you talk about technology, the vehicle for deployment is capital investment, because they're integrated into capital infrastructures as they're developed. It doesn't just fall from heaven. It has to actually be integrated into large capital infrastructures as they're developed, which means the vehicle for deployment is building of scale. So you combine all those three things, and what it paints is a picture that is a tremendous challenge, actually, when you think about rapid acceleration of changing energy systems around the world. Doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means you got to understand the landscape.
Wow.
If I kind of try to summarize what we've heard so far, Ken, is that it's certainly not a one size fit all. It's right. Very specific, and you cannot take a model from, say, Europe and implement it elsewhere, or from the Far East and implement it in other regions or locations. But that's not it. There's also other factors that contribute to how quick that transition can happen and how it could happen. And that's really based on what you already have, the technology that's available, the infrastructure that you've built and the necessity. And coal, I think, was a great example to that. So lots of moving parts there. I would kind of lead on to the question. We've been talking about OECD and the more developed have the resources capable regions or countries. What does that mean to the rest of the world where they're still trying to catch up? I mean, China and India are perhaps across that barrier, but for the other regions that are still adapting to fossil fuel and oil, is renewables exclusive in any sort?
No. In fact, when you go to various countries around the world, particularly those that are stricken with what we call energy poverty, which is a lack of access to modern energy services, it's interesting to see how, when available, energy resources or energy services are provided. In many rural areas, in less developed regions, you actually see the burning of biomass, and this is not environmentally benign. We're talking about dung and trash, right? Waste. Or you see where it can be afforded, small generators that operate on diesel fuel.
Yeah.
These are far inferior to other things that have to be, and typically are delivered at scale, like natural gas or other forms of other sources of power generation. So when you look around the world, you see a very, I mentioned the world of haves and have-nots, right? And I said the OECD has 1.3 billion people in it, but there are roughly twice that many people around the world who don't have access to reliable energy services,
right?
And about 1 billion that don't have access at all.
Yeah.
So what that tells you is that there's a lot of room to make up for people in other parts of the world. And one thing is certainly true: access to energy provides an enormity of opportunity for growth and development.
Right.
And everybody around the world wants what we have in the West.
Yeah.
That is, maybe not politically. That's sort of a side joke, but they certainly want what we have with regard to wealth and prosperity. And so when you think about that, and you think about how massive the energy infrastructures are that exist to service the demands just for the 1.3 billion people that exist in the OECD, now think about doing that for another 6.4 billion, and then extrapolate to 2050, where that number is going to be on the order of 9.6 billion. And most of the delta, if not all, is actually in the non-OECD. You've got a big challenge in front of you.
Yeah.
Challenges always also beget opportunities. Renewables are going to play a massive role in delivering energy services to the world, because they're going to the pace of technology, how it's developing, will also, I think, lead to a transformation in the way we combust hydrocarbons. Sure. One in which we're thinking about not just carbon capture, but also a variety of natural solutions, which are typically fall into the offset category, as well as changing the hydrocarbon itself to a hydrogen fuel source, and thinking about ways to make a marketable commodity out of the carbon feedstock that falls out of it. So I think there's a lot of things, and we already see some of this stuff going on in labs. So it's a matter of time before it gets to that sort of commercial test bed. But there's a lot of really interesting things going on. And quite frankly, given the scale of the energy system that exists today and what's going to be needed to deliver the kind of energy services we have in the wealthy world to the rest of the world, we need everything.
Yeah. And I think on that note, I'll we've said before, as NOV, we've looked at the energy transition as an opportunity to implement the complex problem-solving capabilities that we've had, the technology that we've built, and implement that in areas that require this sort of solution and technology to resolve issues like inability to access energy, harnessing dissipated or lost energy, on whether it's on drilling rigs or on solar farms or on windmills. So really reflect well on what you're saying there, that there's a parallel there for retrofitting or taking on some of what's available.
Absolutely. And I should mention this point. because it ties back to, basically the theme of this conversation. When you think about how regions are all different, and this connects to long sort of standing discussions in the international trade arena. But typically, as countries develop, they exercise growth on the back of things that they have what we call a comparative advantage in. So what can we do at least cost so that it promotes the highest possible growth opportunity?
Mm-hmm.
And when you go around the world, you see that certain regions have certain comparative advantages, others don't. I mean, in a world of energy transitions, there's going to be an increasing need for rare earths, minerals, and metals, as well as processing capability for all those things to be used in some of the new technologies are being developed. But that really paints a picture for regions that have very rich endowments in things like lithium and cobalt and nickel and a host of other things, have the potential to fare very well because they, as a result of their resource endowments, they have a comparative advantage in producing and getting those things to market as they're needed. So what that's going to tell you is that as we go around the world, every country is going to look a little bit different because there's going to be a little, slight differences in what they can exercise to promote growth domestically. And that's actually a really important point that is often left out of discussions around international climate policy and energy transitions. Is this can't be a go it alone discussion, right? It can't be an exercise where everybody just kind of does their own thing. Multilateral approaches for problems of the global commons like this are generally far superior because they recognize, first off, comparative advantages and difference in them across regions, but they also try to leverage those comparative advantages for the benefit of everyone, right? And so you need deeper lines of trade, freer flow of capital, lots of things that unfortunately in the last several years, and this, is a global trend, really driven by populist sentiment, but we seem to have kind of gone back to the age of mercantilism in many respects. And I think you and I were talking earlier, Assaad. I thought we had that fight over 200 years ago, but here we are again. So,
so I know that we're as always the good bad problem, which is we're starting to run out a little bit of time here in our conversation, which has certainly been really insightful and many points you've made that I candidly hadn't really thought about. So certainly looking forward to reading more of your perspectives, Dr. Medlock. But one maybe a point I wanted to touch on before we closed out was talking about disruptive technology. We've been talking about innovation, and I know this is near and dear to Assaad's heart. He's anytime I get to go in his office and chat with him, I think this topic will come up. But when you think about, and we mentioned disruptive technology, Dr. Medlock, what comes to your mind, especially as we look in the energy transition, or as you've mentioned, energy transitions plural space? Are we kind of historic and upcoming? What does that look like?
Great question. And to be honest with you, if I could project what the next great innovation would be, I would bet a bunch of money on it and not be talking to you guys. I'd be laying on a beach somewhere, right? So, when you think about disruptive technologies, the holy grail in electric power has always been utility scale battery storage. And we are, in many respects, on the precipice of that. And when that happens, it will ultimately present a massive breakthrough in the way we think about delivering power to consumers. You just think about it, and I've got a colleague that's done some work on this, thinking about lowest possible costs associated with different types of gen sets that include batteries. Right now, the way we provide power typically to communities around the world is we have systems that have very flexible forms of generation and as well as baseload forms of generation, so that you can provide that power that is sort of always needed, in addition to the up and down that we see on on an hourly and daily basis with regard to demand for electricity. And that means you have a pretty tremendous capital load. Some of that capital is only dispatching, a couple hours a day. Now imagine a world where you could just scale up baseload generation capacity and have a battery that was large enough to absorb power when it's not needed, and then redistribute it to the grid when it is needed. All of a sudden, you don't need all those backup forms of generation. And so the entire landscape of power generation changes dramatically. And, maybe that's going to be complementary to growth in renewables. In certain places where nuclear generation technologies are acceptable and being deployed, maybe it better benefits, nuclear technology. So at the end of the day, batteries do afford a tremendous opportunity. Right. To significantly transform the way we think about power generation. It's not easy, though. There is a fixed cost associated with these installations. They have to compete against existing legacies, and they have to be developed at scale. So again, bringing those three words back in the discussion, it's not going to happen in 5 or 10 years. There's a long road in front of us. In terms of other potential disruptive technologies, there's a host of things we could sort of get into. I think one of the more interesting ones people have started to discuss in earnest involves something that's not really new, but is developing, which is fuel cell technology and hydrogen. Hydrogen, you can think about developing it from electrolysis, using renewables, there's a big push to try to do that. That's the so-called green hydrogen, right? But we already know how to make hydrogen with steam methane reformation, typically use natural gas feedstock. If you want to decarbonize it, you just think about, carbon capture on the back end of that. Right. And there's other ways to do it too. There's some research going on at Rice looking at pyrolysis combustion of a hydrocarbon feedstock. That's an oxygen-starved combustion, so you don't get CO2, you get carbon black. And then that can be used as a feedstock for any wide variety of carbon-based materials, which would ultimately compete with other types of building materials, steel. And so it's really kind of fascinating to think about all the things that are going on, and any one of them could be just tremendously transformative. And I've said this many times. I actually said it at a Senate energy hearing once, and I think the next 3 questions, each one of the senators commented about their own grandchild. But I said, the next great innovation is in the mind of a 4-year-old somewhere playing with Legos. Yeah. We have no idea what it is, which is what makes this business so just incredible to watch on a day-to-day basis, because there's just so much going on that most people in the general public don't even realize until it hits them, right? And there's a lot of stuff happening. And given the demands on the energy system globally, not just from how much energy is needed to sate global demand going not only currently but going forward, but some of the environmentally motivated pressures, ESG, investor guidance, consumer preferences, it's really demanding things transform at a pace in many ways we haven't seen before. And again, that really promotes some significant opportunity. It's less of a challenge and more of an opportunity for the creative minds to step forward and sort of rise to the challenge.
Wow. That's some great insight. Certainly a lot to think about as we wrap up today's conversation. So I think we may have, I don't know if we had maybe one question that we're able to squeeze in today, because we've, you have really given us a lot to think about. So we'll go on and bring Shelby Dumaine in to see if we can get one in real quick before we let Dr. Medlock do whatever it is Dr. Medlocks do when they're not gracing us here on the Ask Assaad show.
Absolutely. Yeah, I did have one question. So you talked a lot about, all the different forms of energy. Talked coal, wind, oil. But I'm curious, could you talk a little bit about the role that natural gas plays in energy transition?
Sure. So I sort of referenced this a little bit when I was talking about the Texas experience, right? Natural gas is, it's really been the fuel and the power system that has provided stability to the grid in Texas. But more generally, it is, in terms of carbon intensiveness, the most favorable of all the hydrocarbon fuels. There are things that need to be dealt with through the value chain, like methane emissions, flaring, these sorts of things. But those are ultimately addressable. It's just a matter of there being appropriate guidance either from investors or through government policy to make sure that that happens. So natural gas actually is going to play a really important role. And most of the growth that we're going to see with regard to natural gas is going to be outside of the United States and outside of Europe as we go forward. It's going to be in high demand destination, sort of what we would call end of pipe markets, right? Either through the delivery of LNG or the delivery of long haul pipeline capacity. So all of that stuff bodes well for natural gas. And, I often comment to my students when they ask a similar question like this: if you want to know what's going to happen next in energy, start looking at what's going on at port facilities, what's going on with investments in expanding port footprints and how those are being directed. And you'll start to get a good picture of what's coming in the next 5 to 10 years. And when you look at those types of investments in other places around the world, you see investments that are very favorable to growth in natural gas demand. And so as we go forward, gas is going to play a significant role, without a doubt, because, as we've already referenced, the amount of demand growth that's coming out of the developing world, it will continue to be substantial. And I'll throw one just additional data point on here, because it really speaks to the importance of multilateralism and the role that natural gas can play. There's a lot of emphasis on CO2 emission reduction, right? And rightfully so. But emissions in the OECD have not really grown in the last 20 or 25 years. In the non-OECD, the story is very different. So much so that if all OECD countries could cut emissions to zero today, global emissions would fall to 1995 levels. That's it.
Wow.
That tells you how much demand has grown outside of the OECD. And, it's driven by a host of factors that, if you're in Beijing, the world you see out your window looks very different than the world you see out your window in Houston, or if you're in, Abuja, or if you're in, pick a big city around the world, and the view's just different. Yeah. And that's something that we have to continually remind as we think about what the future is going to bring.
That's great. I want to make an exception and take a couple more minutes. Can't let you go, Dr. Ken, without asking a closing question. When we're talking about growing economies, talking about growing energy demand, and growing populations really around the world, some have asked for a shift away from fossil fuels, and it's really the energy transition in its singular form. But as we've just discussed and you've referenced, that's just not as simple as it sounds. How much of an undertaking, if we want to summarize the conversation, is it to make that shift away from fossil fuel, do you think?
Massive. There's really no short way to say that other than just massive. Look, just to put it into perspective, I'll give you just a little more data as food for thought. Back to the mid-1980s, right, as a point of reference. So roughly 35 years. Why 35 years? Because we can fast forward 35 years, and that puts us in the time frame that a lot of folks are talking about net zero ambitions and sort of driving carbon emissions to their end, basically, right? Hydrocarbons as a fraction of global energy demand in 1985 was a little over 88% of the energy mix. Mm-hmm. In 2019, it was a little over 84% of the energy mix. 20 of those years, so the last 20 years, there has been tremendous movement with very ambitious government support to integrate renewables more intensively into the mix. Yeah. Most of that is focused on electricity. Electricity is still, roughly globally in the high 30 to low 40% range of all energy used. Mm-hmm. When you get outside of electricity demand, it is a hydrocarbon discussion. Even in the electricity discussion is still dominantly a hydrocarbon discussion. Yep. So in the last 35 years, we haven't moved the needle much, right? Even though the last half of that has been characterized by pretty significant support to do just that. Yeah. Again, that brings legacy and scale back into the discussion. Why? Yep. Yeah. it's a challenge. I mean, this is actually why we have to think about leveraging existing infrastructures to come up with lower carbon solutions. So this is where I mentioned hydrogen, right, and use of SMRs with carbon capture. That still allows a robust natural gas industry to exist, utilize existing infrastructure to move and ship natural gas all over the world, because you can put an SMR anywhere. Right? You just change the way you combust it. So a lot of those types of things are going to be part of the discussion. It's not possible to do it any other way. And so, yes, addressing the carbon footprint is important. Governments, citizens, investors, they're all getting behind this. So at some point, all firms around the world that are involved in this space have to as well. And I think you're already seeing movement in that direction. So, but it doesn't eliminate hydrocarbons from the value stream at all. It means they're part of the solution.
Well, Dr. Medlock, really appreciate you sharing your insight. Certainly a lot of research behind your comments today, and certainly encourage folks if they're interested to check out some of the articles and other publications that you and your cohorts have provided. So again, speaking with Dr. Ken Medlock III, he is the James A. Baker III and Susan G. Baker Fellow in Energy and Resource Economics and Senior Director of the Baker Institute Center for Energy Studies. So appreciate you sharing your perspective and being on the Ask Assaad show today.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. And everybody stay safe and stay healthy. And I'll just reiterate how the show sort of opened about missing how important the audience engagement is. That's actually something I really miss, is being able to talk to people face to face. So hopefully this is all behind us sooner rather than later, and we can get back to that.
Well, I'd give you a high five, but my computer screen doesn't.
Virtual high five.
Yeah, exactly. Well, great. Well, thanks again for your time, Assaad. Thanks for your insight as always in bringing that to us. And as Shelby likes to always remind us, rightfully so, thank you, the viewers, for joining us today and for being a part of the conversation. And if you have any questions or comments on today's conversation with Dr. Medlock, or any of the comments that Assaad was able to make, or any future ideas for guests or topics, feel free to send us an email, and you can do that at askassad@nov.com. So from all of us here at NOV, thanks for watching and for listening, and we'll talk to you again next time.